Okay, good day. So we have a new topic for lecture 24. This is Rizal's annotation of Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So, 'di ba? After we've talked about the life ni Rizal sa last 25 hours niya, sa iyang trial, sa iyang kamatayon, and the controversy about the document of retraction, which is supposedly gisulat niya. After ato ng mga topic, we're gonna talk about na dayon sa iyahang mga works, sa iyahang major works, the most important niya ng mga legacies. So, we have 5 works for that series of lectures, starting from the Rizal's Annotation of Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, No Limitang Here, El Filibusterismo, Philippines a Century Hence, The Indolence of the Filipino People, ay, numday siya, ang katupong letter to the young woman of Malolos. So, this is for the next na mga lectures, that's from lecture 24 and so on. So, karon we will start with Rizal's Annotation of Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So, para masabtan nato, unsa di ay ni siya na work about. So, pag moingon tag annotation, it is a note of explanation or comment added to a text or diagram. So, pag moingon tag annotating, it is the action of annotating or explaining or commenting or analyzing about a text, a book, a diagram, an essay, an article, but most of the time it is about books, syempre, completed and published na works. So, pag moingon ta og Rizal's annotation of the book Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, Rizal made comments, analyzed the book's sources, yung pagiging historically accurate niya, kung anong sources na ginamit ni sa writer of the Sucesos. So, technically, what Rizal did was to analyze, to look at thoroughly the book Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So, first question na kinahanglan nato tubagon, what is Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas? Nganong naka-decide man si Rizal na kanina book ang iyang i-annotate? And kung hunahunaon nimo, importante guro jud kaayo ni na book, no? Kay nganong Rizal himself had found it important to look for the kanang si tawag ani a copy of this book. If you remember, this Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas was the one na iyahang gi-copy in his own writings in the British Library. Yeah? And it is parang on the same timeline gani sa iyahang pagsulat sa iyahang No Limitang Here. But aside from that, what is Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas di? So, it is one of the important works on the early history of the Spanish colonization of the Philippines, published in Mexico in 1609 by Antonio de Morga. So, this is a historical book. This is the first book published about the history of the Philippines. So, again, this is the first na book which is written about the history of the Philippines, specifically the transition period of the Philippines from its original culture, original society, and then the coming of the Spaniards, and then the changes in the first part or the first na decade or first years sa pag-colonize ni Spanish diri sa Pilipinas. And it's not just about also actually nakalang Philippines lang, but also the conquest of Spain in Asia. So it is very important again because it introduces the Philippines formally to the rest of the world. Kung ano yung nangyari, kung ano yung mga nakita ng isang Antonio de Morga sa Pilipinas. And this annotation of Jose Rizal was nagsulat pod og prologue or sort of introduction si iyang friend na si Ferdinand Blumentritt about ani. And ang kani man gud na libro Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. Again, it is the first history book pod na written by a layman. Dili isa ka pari. Kay usual manggod sa early Spanish colonization na period. Ang mga memoirs, ang mga documents is written by Jesuit priests. It's written by the church. So this book gives a new perspective. And also, Antonio Morga is dili lang siya basta-basta na tawo na makaingon kag musulat man siya about sa history sa Philippines, kinsa di ay na siya. So, Antonio de Morga is a Spanish conquistador, a government official, and a historical anthropologist. And he is the author of the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, or in its English translation, the events in the Philippine Islands. So he wrote the first formal history of the Philippine conquest by Spain, and he has a doctorate in canon law and civil law. So unsa may meaning ana kung kuan pa kay si tawag ani lawyer siya. So he has this professional background, and kung kuaron pa unsay mga nahimong sources niya when he wrote Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. Pinaka first and pinaka importante is experience, because note the word na he is one of the Spanish conquistador and a government official himself in the Philippines. And also he is part of the generation which built and established a strong colony diri sa Pilipinas. So also tungod pud sa iyahang professional background, is a practitioner of law. He has this access to documents, to official documents, official reports in ana. So kung huna-hunaon jud nimo, Antonio de Morga is or have authority over the subject of the history sa mga panghitabo diri sa Pilipinas. Also, his history is valuable in that Morga had access, this is what I said, to the survivors of the earliest days of the colony, and he himself participated in many of the accounts that he rendered. Also, as a practitioner of law and a government official himself, he has the know-how in the processes of the government. So kung kuan pa, kay naay validity ang iyahang mga comments or iyahang perspective ba, because as we know, when you are writing history, di ba, lantawon pa agad pud nimo ang background sa author, because kung janitor lang ka, dili ka pwede magsulat about sa history sa isa ka country, or history about sa Malacañang, or history about sa isa ka company. Nga naman, imo trabaho janitor. So kung lantawon nimo, you have a different perspective sa kato ng company kaysa atong naagyo sa taas. So this is on Antonio Morga. Dili ka kahisgot about the governor generals or the history of the Philippines before the Spanish, ato naabot sa Spanish, and the changes. Dili ka kahisgot about their society, their beliefs, the changes in the policies in ana if wala ka kasabot yourself. So this makes the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas a valuable na libro and a source for the Filipinos about their background. So, pura na siya mahisgutan pag abot na sa side ni Rizal. So, the book Sucesos narrates the history of wars, intrigues, diplomacy, and evangelization of the Philippines in a somewhat disjointed way. Modern historians, including Rizal, have noted that Morga has a definite bias and would often distort facts or even rely on invention to fit his defense of the Spanish conquest. But still, even though naay authority si Antonio de Morga about the topic na iyang gisulatan, we cannot dili jud mo malikayan na adjoy bias. Syempre, because he is a Spanish himself. He looks at things, he looks at the action of the Spanish in their perspective. Murag kung kuan pa, syempre, ma-define niya in a right way, or iyahang ma-defend ang actions ni Spanish. And also, he would really see the conquest of the Spanish as a good na deed, or kung kuan pa kay calling sa Ginoo para sa ilaha. That's also one of the downsides of this book, syempre, because not really downside, but kung ano dyan yung mulahi dyan na perspective kani si Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. So this is on the cover page and the picture of the book. So Morgas, what is the purpose of Morga in writing Sucesos? Morga wrote that the purpose of writing Sucesos was so he could chronicle, meaning document, the deeds achieved by our Spaniards, the discovery, conquest, and conversion of the Filipinas islands, as well as various fortunes that they have from time to time, and the great kingdoms and among the pagan peoples surrounding the islands. So talagang for him, it is a noble and good mission or deed. So taking issue with the scopes of these claims, Rizal argued that the conversion and conquest were not as widespread as portrayed because the missionaries were only successful in conquering a portion of the population of certain islands. So here, diba, if the atong gisgutan karon is the background, the sort of unsay sulod, unsay topic ni Sucesos. So if imo siyang malantaw, Sucesos is about again the conquest, the process, the goal, the mission behind it, and the vision of the Spanish nga nung ilahang gi-conquest ang Philippines and islands in the east. So pero kani if you can remember, I always say again and again that Rizal has this big frustration of not being able to defend the Philippines when the Spanish says na if wala mi wala mo, if wala mi wala mo na develop, if wala mi hitans Japon mo, uncivilized Japon mo, uneducated Japon mo, underdeveloped Japon mo. So Rizal really has this frustration na gusto niya ma-defend ang culture, ang identity sa Pilipinas. So the answer to that frustration came with this book. So, diba, as I said kanina, this book introduced the Philippines to the rest of the world through its existence as a historical na book written by an authoritative na figure. So Rizal had wrote a annotation about alin na libro to correct and to give the writers a parang eye-opener na whatever ang kaming mga gisulat ni Antonio Morga is not divine or not really perfect. Naapod siya yung mga sayop na gipang buhat and naa siya yung mga sayop na gipang storya. And iyang mga descriptions also has faults. So, murag kung kuan pa, gitry og correct ni Rizal and gitry niya og explain it on the side of the Philippines. So, again, first na diri pa lang daan makita na nato ang mga annotation ni Rizal from the first sa introduction na dyan na-appeal ang imuhang kung ano ba purpose of writing when you write an essay or ana, diba? So, diri pa lang niingon si Morga na niingon na kanang ang purpose nila is to to convert and to discover, but Rizal said na ang conversion daw na nahitabo sa mga Filipinos into into Catholicism is not as widespread as kung unsag pagka-discuss or pagka-portray ni Morga because according to Rizal lagi na it is more on the Luzon ra dili to the rest of Labaw na sa Mindanao. So pa lang daan. Okay, so Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas has 8 chapters. Chapter 1, explaining Magellan and Legazpi's expedition. And chapter 2 to 7 is the chronological report on government administrations under different governor general. So in each chapter, it is about an administration of a different na governor general. So this is parang a record of unsay nahitabo on this time under ani na Governor General, and then the next na po dayon lahi na po ng Governor General. So policies sila mga gipangbuhat and the important events in the Philippines. And the 8th chapter is about the Philippine Islands, the natives there, their antiquity, custom, government, their society, yung educational system, even beliefs, even some tidbits of explanation sa kung ano yung nakita niyang part of the original na culture. Also, some books gani about explaining the Annotation Result says na one of the biggest na sayop daw or bias na giingon ni Morga dadto is calling the babaylands parang a practice from hell, or kung kuan pa kay sa to kayawan una practice, because babaylands daw are kanang nagdalet sa ilang kaugalingon na i-channel ang bad spirits or evil spirits, even gani daw ang spirit ni Satan diri sa kalibutan. Para sa iya, ang practice of the babaylands is a bad thing, or it is a practice of kanang worshiping the devil. But for us baya, kay ang babaylan, it is kuan ba kung sa ato pagani, kay basic na example ana na kuan is kwak doktor ba, di ba? Sila ba nimo kanang mo commune with the mga namatay sa una, uso da kanang sila pud ning mga muhil sa mga naay sakit through nature spirits, di ba? Sila nang mga nag-offer og sacrifices if magkasakit ka inani inana, but this practice is makita ba gyapon nato hangtod karon. So the most important part daw for us Filipinos is this chapter 8, Philippine Islands, the natives, because it will give us a picture of who we are before. It will answer na unsa di ay ta before, and also it will give us the idea na we are someone before naabot si Spanish. So this is also the value of this libro. It gives us a source of knowledge kung kinsa ta before naabot si Spanish. Okay. So what leads Jose Rizal to Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas? Rizal was an earnest seeker of truth, and this marked him as a historian. Earnest seeker of truth. Truth being unsa jud ay nahitabo, kinsa jud ay ta, tinuod ba gyud na dili ta developing before sila naabot. And he has a desire to know exactly the conditions of the Philippines when the Spaniards came ashore to the islands, and his theory was that the country was economically self-sufficient and prosperous. Also, he entertained the idea that it had a lively and vigorous community. He believed that the conquest of the Spaniards contributed in part to the decline of Philippines' rich tradition and culture. So, he believed that the conquest of the Spaniards contributed to the decrease of our sense of identity, of us embracing our original na culture. So, parang for him, taliwas talaga yung reality sa mga sinasabi ni Spanish na, again, pag wala daw si Spanish, wala daw ito na-develop. But for Rizal, no. Actually, ang nahitabo, because of you, we declined. Because of you, the rich tradition and culture of the Filipinos, the Philippines had started to change. Imbes na naatay tradition and atong own na culture, original na culture and tradition, we started to have this culture and tradition na magsigig adapt. Doon ba na makit-an Japon na ito na hangtod karon na murag nagsugod ta og sige na lang adapt og mga foreign na mga practice and culture. We are not really that kung kuan pa embracing our identity, but we have this practice of considering mga foreign cultures as more mas maayo na waton. Kung lantaon pa nimo, di ba, sa ato ang language, pasabot nimo ma'am, dili man gyud siya tinuod, pero kung lantaon bitaw din jud ninyo kay sakto jud siya actually because we've started to kanang adapt na maglibog na ta kung unsa jud ang original na kita. Even our language itself, di ba? You cannot speak a sentence even in vernacular without adding a word in English. For example, magstorya ta about isa ka sentence. O, dito pa lang daan. Magstorya ta about sa isa ka sentence. O, dili na gani na to mahuman ang atong istorya without adding a foreign word. Nya, kung lantaw nimo, that is not baya supposedly the ideal. Diba? Kung lantaw nimo, Japan is a very good example, ana. Okay, they use their own language in teaching. They use their own language in communicating. Mao ganing na ay native camp, no? Na ay online teaching about English ay laha because dili siya para sa atua. Na ay mga bata karon nga mas maayo pa mo English. Na ay mga bata na, "Hey, I'm Peppa Pig." So, di ba na anay British accent? In Japan kay ilahang books gani is written baya in their original na language. So, it shows yun nga, yung pagiging proud and pushing na dapat ang mga Japanese kay knows the Japanese language. But kita, that's a problem na nakita ni Rizal labaw na sa iyahang time na the Filipinos has lost sight kung kinsa gid sila. And mahisgutan po na siya kato na ingon katong akong ingon na the Filipinos has lost sight of kung kinsa gid sila. Ma-discuss pa gyud na sa iyahang ubang mga libro. Labaw na specifically sa Philippines as a century hence. Katong ikaupat na work niya na atong hisgutan. So much for that. That's the reason nganong naabot si Rizal or nganong nag-annotate si Rizal sa Sucesos. So he then decided to undertake the annotation of Antonio de Morga. His personal friendship with Ferdinand Blumentritt provided the inspiration for doing a new edition of Morga Sucesos. So kikisa daw siya nakahibalo about sa libro sa Sucesos de las Islas, Filipinas. Pinakadako daw na possibility is gikan sa iyahang friend. Professor friend niya na si Ferdinand Blumentritt. Mao ganing gihatag ni Rizal ang honor sa pagsulat sa prologue kay Ferdinand Blumentritt. Also, di ba? Rizal devoted 4 months in research and writing about this book and almost a year to get his manuscript published in Paris in January 1890. So Rizal spent his entire stay in the city of London at the British Museum reading room. Having found Morga's book, he laboriously, di natong hisgutan, di ba? Nahisgutan nato ni during his travels abroad na iyag yung gikapi ang 351 pages of the Sucesos. And after that, proceeded to annotate every chapter of the Sucesos. Grabe siya ka-hard worker, no? Kita gani kay kung dili pa kinahanglan ang thesis para mo graduate, di kita mag-thesis. Diba? And here is sa case ni Rizal, ganahan kay siya, no? But, yeah. Rizal's annotation of Morga's Sucesos. His extensive annotations of Morga's work number no less than 639 items or almost 2 annotations for every page. What do you mean by that? 2 notes or 2 comments for every page sa libro na iyahang gikopya. Rizal also annotated Morga's typographical errors. So, diba? As I said kaganina, pag mo annotate ka, some goes as far as comment about the language usage, the sentence, the grammar, the sentence construction. So, gibuhat na ni Rizal. He commented on every statement that he would that could be nuanced in Filipino cultural practices. For example, on page 248, Morga describes the culinary art of Okay. Again, Rizal commented on every statement that could be nuanced in Filipino cultural practices. For example, on page 248, Morga describes the culinary art of the ancient Filipinos by recording, "They prefer to eat salt fish which began to decompose and smell." Rizal said, in defense of the Filipinos, this is another preoccupation of the Spaniards who, like any other nation in that matter of food, loathe that to which they are not accustomed or is unknown to them. The fish that Morga mentions does not taste but, better when it is beginning to rot. All on the contrary, it is bagoong, yes, diba? And all those who have eaten it and tasted it know it is not or ought not to be rotten. So, in defense, again, ana siya na dili na siya about kanang, sa tawag ani, dili man na daot ang kanang ginakaon sa Filipino. It is bagoong. It is, sa to, ang sige term, ana, dili na ko malitok. Basta kay mauna na siya. Then, naabiya sa ato ang practices na, ay naasa to ang culture ba na, kanang, kung kuan pa kay dili ta mukaon og bagoong tungod kay pobrita or inanginana. Na times na mangitak na gyud ta ana, di ba? And we have so many kinds of bagoong. Shellfish, isda na gamay, isda na dako, shrimp, di ba? We do so many kinds of bagoong. So, ang pagka-describe ni Morga is negative kaayo ang connotation. But, again, yan, sa annotation ni Rizal, iyang giingon na, it is not actually a bad tasting or rotten of food. It is bagoong. And bagoong is part of being a Filipino. So, that's one of the examples of Rizal's annotation. Ito pa. Rizal's annotation. Rizal commits here. Kadipod. When Rizal annotated the book ni Morga, he made mistakes. Just like us studying history. Kasi, naamang tay this notion na pag maghisgot ta about a past event, ang atuang panlantaw ato niya is based on our standards karon. About sa event, about sa gipangbuhat sa isa ka tawo, for example, ani, kung maghisgot ta about kay Hitler, katong sa pagpatay niya sa mga Jews, sa katong iyahang mga katong sa pag-experiment daw niya, di ba, sa katong pagbutang niya sa isa ka camp sa ilaha and later nahibalaan nagpangpatay din niya hinahinay. And kung natawo nato na siya in our own standards, dili gyud nimo ma-defend. Ako kay di man ko pro Hitler ha, pero kung hunaon nimo ba, para sa tuwa, totally evil si Hitler. Totally bad ang iyang gistorya. Pero kung lantawo nimo sa iyahan na perspective o sa ilahan na time, kay naapod siya point because the Jews are not original baya nagikan silang lugar, and also ang mga Jew kay nagapangilog sa opportunities na para sa citizens jud under kay Hitler, sa opportunities sa trabaho, sa housing, sa even sa resources sa country. And kung huna-hunaon po daw, kung napatay daw tanan ni Hitler ang Jews before, kay mas gamay daw ang casualties kaysa sa panghitabo sa Middle East karon. But si point nimo, ma'am, naagid tayo sayop na ginabuhat when we study history. We look at the events and the tawo, the actions, the mga paghitabo in our own standards, but supposedly that is not right. Dapat daw, when we study history, we look at the time. We discuss, we define terms, we define the events, we define the person, the actions of a person, depende sa iyahang time. We must understand the event according to its timeline. Or parehas diri sa atong gibuhat kay Rizal, di ba? Before ta naghisgot about siyang life, gisabot sa nato ang iyahang time, iyahang generation, di ba? That's the 19th century Philippines. So dapat as a historian or as a student, as a maestra studying, talking about history, dapat dili daw ta man judge. But sa side ni Rizal, sayop jud daw kaayo si Rizal kay from the very first pa lang jud ang iyahang purpose nga nung nag-annotate siya kay awayon si Morga, di ba? I-bash ang iyahang work, i-correct ang iyahang work, i-discuss na sayop si Morga, i-discuss na inani inana kay bias siya, kay na siya prejudices. That is supposedly not right because kung hunahunaon nimo 1609 is very different from the time ni Rizal na the 19th century or the 1800s. That's almost 200 baya kapin na years. Not almost gani, but 200 years kapin apart. And kung hunahunaon ganin nimo, di ba? 2019 is very different from 2020. So, kung lantaon nimo 1600s is very different from the 1800s. So, ang mga gipang storya ni Morga is depende sa iyahang own definition, sa iyahang own na time, sa iyahang own na generation. And here comes Rizal, a product of the 19th century, saying na sayop siya. Sakto man, ay, kung kuan pa kay, okay man, nag-annotate si Rizal. Okay man ang iyang gibuhat. Pero in the thought na judger kay siya and iyahag yung iyang standard when he looked at the work ni Morga kay iyahang time, it is not fair for Morga. Yes, that's the meaning of this first number 1. Rizal commits the error of many historians in appraising the event of the past in the light of the present standards. Kadua, Rizal's attacks on the church were unfair and unjustified because the abuses of the friars should not be construed to mean that Catholicism is bad. Kanipod, gi-generalize manggod ni Rizal. Ang katong mga abuses na gibuhat sa mga pari, dili baya meaning ana na ang whole na dayon na Catholic Church kay sayo. That's the problem with the annotation ni Rizal actually. Ang iyahang purpose ug iyahang tone. But even gani pod even though inani ang iyahang mga faults na gibuhat, this annotation ni Rizal about the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas gave the book a credibility for us Filipinos to read and appreciate the libro. Ani man gud ni? Kung wala nag-annotate si Rizal, the Filipinos would not consider to believe sa mga gipang storya ni Morga. Syempre, kay Spanish man gud siya. We have this notion na whatever man ang gistorya ang gihimo sa mga Spanish, bad na silang tanan. Parehas gyud punta kay Rizal, i-generalize man gud nato. So, kung wala nag-annotate si Rizal about sa Sucesos, we will not use or we will not embrace the informations na gipang hatag or gisulat ni Morga. So, the value, magsugod sa ta again. Let's as a summary, no? The book Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas is very important itself. Balag wala pa nag-annotate si Rizal, balag wala pa siya gibuhat, importante na gud kaayo ni na libro, valuable jud kaayo. Because again, it's the first history book about the Philippine Islands. Anong tawag nito? It describes the Philippines before and during the first parts of the colonization period. Then naapag yung authority and credibility ang gasulat, and also kung kuan pa, it is really written in a historical na manner. So that's the value of the book. And dayon, the value of the annotation ni Rizal. It gave the book a credibility or kanang tong sense na ma-trustan nato mga Filipinos ang mga gipang sulat ni Morga because Rizal himself said so. And kung naaman gani mga gipang sulat si Morga, naa na to sa annotation ni Rizal. So this annotation is one of the most important na legacies. So let's talk about dayon pod sa katong sa tawag ani sa epilogue or sa katong sort of introduction na gisulat ni Blumentritt. So, Ferdinand Blumentritt also wrote a preface emphasizing some salient points. The Spaniards have to correct their erroneous conception of the Filipinos as children of limited intelligence. So, dapat daw tarungon ni Spanish ang iyahang paglantaw sa Pilipinas. Kadua, that there existed three kinds of Spanish delusions about the Philippines. Filipinos were an inferior race. Filipinos were not ready for parliamentary representation and other reforms. Kaya tulo, denial of equal rights can be compensated by strict dispensation of justice. So, para kay Blumentritt, dapat usbon Spanish. So, the prologue is written in Spanish instead of his native German language. Praised Rizal's work as scholarly and well thought out. He noted the Morga Sucesos was so rare that the very few libraries that have it guard it with the same solicitude as if it is a treasure of the Incas. Incas is what's the tawag ni? A civilization in Latin America, which is one of the biggest. Last, he criticized Rizal's annotation on two counts. He first observed that Rizal had committed the mistake of many modern historians, just like we discussed. He perceived this as the overreach of Rizal's denunciation of Catholicism, same Japon, di ba? As we discussed, na nag-generalize lagi si Rizal. Honest pod ka yung friend ni Rizal, no? Ganahan ko, ana, na friend, nandili ka, i-backbite ba, no? But istoryahon jud sa imong atubangan ng nawong jud ka og istorya. Ayos yun na siya na friend. So much for that. Rizal's purpose. Yes, in Jose Rizal's dedication, he explained, among other things, the purpose of the new edition of Morga's Sucesos. If the book succeeds in awakening in you the consciousness of our past, which has been obliterated from our memory, excuse me, and in rectifying what has been falsified and calumniated, I shall not have labored in vain. And on such basis, little though it may be, we can all devote ourselves to studying the future. So, sa point niya. Point niya na ang yahag yung gusto mahitabo ani is, again, no, as I said, awakening in you the sense of identity as a Filipino. And if nanatay identity of the Filipino, we will look at the future with a united eye and a more na passionate and zeal para sa tong country. So, okay. Three main propositions in Rizal's new edition. The people of the Philippines had a culture in their own. That's the point, mga points na gusto niya i-emphasize. The Philippines, again, and the people of the Philippines had a culture in their own before the coming of the Spaniards. Filipinos were decimated, demoralized, exploited, and ruined by the Spanish colonization. Katulo, the present state of the Philippines was not necessarily superior to its past. Na moingon man gani si Rizal na kung wala naabot si Spanish, we will be, or supposedly, we are more developed and more, more rich. Rizal's annotation in his historical essay, which includes a narration of the Philippine colonial history, punctuated as it was with incidences of agony, tensions, tragedy, and prolonged periods of suffering that many of the people had been subjected to. He correctly observed that as a colony of Spain, the Philippines was depopulated, impoverished, and retarded, astounded by metaphor, with no confidence in her past, still without faith in her present, and without faltering hope in the future. So, jud, he point out jud ni Rizal na because of the Spanish, we continued to be impoverished, and we have this sense of kanang inferiority in terms of intelligence and capability, and also wala tay confidence kung kinsa ta, wala pud tay faith na ma-okay ang atong present, and labaw na wala tay hope para sa future. Ayos kaayo iko ihimong caption. Yes. Okay. He further said, little by little, the Filipinos, lost their old traditions. the mementos of their past. They gave up on their writing, their songs, their poems, their laws in order to learn other doctrines which they did not understand. I-point out po ni Rizal. Also, this, kani bitaw na yan na statement, kaning in order to learn other doctrines which they did not understand, madiscuss pag yun niya sa iyang Philippines essentially hence because kung ang tao nimo ang purpose ug ang point gyud kay connected jud kayo ang kanina annotation og katong gisulat ni Rizal about sa Philippines 100 years forwards. Kaya hisgutan na lang man jud to na na essay kato magud ang topic niya is kanang unsa kahay mga possible mahitabo kay Philippines 100 years forward. Then unsay mga reasons ana og unsay mga roots ana. So it is actually very connected with this, but yes. Another morality, another aesthetic sa ato ang dinamitan sa gawi nato, different from those inspired by their climate and their manner of thinking. Here, ngano daw magkuanta atong gina-adapt ang sinuutan sa Spanish ang ilahang quote kana bitawng slacks and coat sa mga babae na with all the ruffles with all the kanang long sleeve na mga lacy na kung nataw nimo init man guys Pilipinas no suot man kag inana nganong mag-hope man ka na maputi nganong mag-hope man ka na ma-blonde imong buhok na init man guys Pilipinas na ito man imong buhok nganong ito man ang buhok sa Filipino syempre kay init kaayo para maprotektahan di ba mao gani na ang pigment sa tong skin kay darker because to protect us from skin cancer pero wala dili na nato siya hunang-unaan kay para sa ato mas puti, mas dato, mas gwapa. They declined, the Filipinos declined, degrading themselves in their own eyes. Bakita palang daan, ginadegrade na nato tong kaugalingon. They became ashamed of what was their own. They became ashamed of their own practices, their own religion. Diba? We are forced to accept all the new practices, all the doctrines of the church. Na supposedly before we have our own baya na kanang set of beliefs. So we became ashamed of what we have before because moingon magud sa Spanish na dili man to civilized niyo mga practices before, dili to siya according to the Bible and inani na pag mag-practice pag ani kaana meaning wala kay faith. For Rizal, that's very negative. They began to admire and praise whatever was foreign and incomprehensible. And hangtod karon makita jud nato ni siya. No. K-pop pa more. Hollywood pa more. Diba? Ang mga kanta, Hollywood, laban ng jud. Diba? Even atong songs, atong OPM na mga songs, original Pinoy daw na music, pero in English. Sabtan ko ninyo. Ano na? Their spirit was damaged and it surrendered. Here. Kani jud, para kay Rizal bitaw, the Filipinos, nganong ning taas og ayo ang atong pagka-colony ni Spain, nganong naabot siya 333 years. Ang reason ana, our fighting spirit was damaged. We surrendered. We thought na mao naman jud ni, nani naman jud ni, wala man tayo mabuhat ani. We became passive. We surrendered to our fates and supposedly it's not right. And mag-discuss pa jud nato na siya, ang kana siya na thought, ang kaning mga gipang surrender Rizal further sa uban niya ng mga libro and writings. Okay. To the Filipinos, in my Nolimitang Here, I commence to sketch the present conditions obtaining in our country. The effect produced by my efforts gave me to understand, before proceeding to develop before your eyes other successive scenes, that it is necessary to first lay bare the past in order to better judge the present and to survey the road trodden during 3 centuries. So, kung gi-present ni Rizal diri na mao again mura niya og gitagaan og another na pud na description ang katong iyang giingon na before ka makasabot sa present kinahanglan sa ka makasabot sa past, and before ka makakita sa imong future, before ka makahope sa imong future kinahanglan ka makasabot sa imong present. So here, di ba? Kung ano limitang hearing niya nag-describe sa reality sa situation of Philippines during his time, in real time. Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas gives us the background. Okay. Like almost all of you, I was born and brought up in ignorance of our country's past, and so without knowledge or authority to speak of what I neither saw nor have I studied, I deem it necessary to quote the testimony of an illustrious Spaniard who in the beginning of the new era controlled the destinies of the Philippines and had personal knowledge of our ancient nationality in its last days. It is then the shade of our ancestors' civilization, which the author will call before you. If the work serves to awaken in you a consciousness of our past and to blot from your memory or to rectify what has been falsified or is calumny, then I shall not have labored in vain. With this preparation start through it, maybe we can all pass to the study of the future. And ang study sa future na iyang pasabot diri naa sa iyahang essay sa Philippines a Century Hence. Okay. So the Annotation of Rizal appeared for the first time in the Philippines 68 years later when a publisher in Manila published the new work in 1958 to contribute his bit to the national effort to honor Rizal. The present work is the sixth volume of the series of the writings of Rizal, which the Jose Rizal National Centennial Commission has now published in commemoration of his birth. So that's 68 later ni appear ang kaniniya na libro na annotation 68 years after siya namatay. Okay, so as a conclusion, again, according to Rizal, to foretell the destiny of a nation, it is necessary to open the books that tell of her past. Okay. If you have questions, again, please post or direct that questions to me, or you can comment that down below. Wow, go vlog. Subscribe and like this video, comment down below. But yes, I am serious. If namoy pangutana, you can address that directly. And please, you can ask your questions. Kaya pag mangutana na ako sa ato ang group chat or pag mag-video call ta, basta man, okay ra ang discussion. Wala tuwag. Okay, thank you for listening. So, stay tuned for the next lecture and be excited jud sa sunod na mga topics because it will be about no limitang here and el filibusterismo. So, have a good night.